Greeting everyone. We are now looking at chapter 2, which is about kinds of test and testing. In the previous chapter, we did an amazing job. You did an amazing job in defining language test and language testing and comparing the old and current trends in language testing. So understanding those will help you understand this chapter a little bit easier. In the chapter, we will look at the 4 types of language tests, which include proficiency tests, achievement tests, diagnostic tests, and placement tests. And we'll also discuss 5 other types of language testing, which include direct and indirect testing, discrete point and integrative testing, norm referenced and criterion reference testing, objective testing and subjective testing, and communicative language testing. So let us look at the first type of test, which is the proficiency test. The proficiency test is a type of language test that measures how well someone can use a language. So unlike other tests, it doesn't consider your previous experience or training, just your current level of the language. The test items aren't designed for any specific groups, but instead, they try to assess how proficient you are, no matter your age or background. So a good example of this is in an IELTS test, where younger students might score higher than older candidates, or teachers might score higher than students. That's because IELTS tests isn't designed just for students or teachers specifically. It's for everybody who wants to measure their language ability. Now, there are 2 main types of proficiency tests. The first one is what we call tests for specific purposes. For example, a test for university students, may check if they have the English skills needed to study in an English-speaking country. So some tests might be different for art students and science students because the language used in each of those subjects is different. Or a test for job applicants, like for a translator. They focus on whether they can use the language professionally, such as translating speeches or documents. And then we have the general proficiency tests. These are broader and not tied to any specific job or course. For examples, the Cambridge First Certificate in English, the FCE tests, the Cambridge Certificate of Proficiency, the CPE test, the IELTS test, the TOEFL test, and even our own APT test, and even the entrance exam. So these tests measure how well your English ability is, your overall English ability at this moment, without focusing on any particular subject or profession. Another important thing to think about when it comes to proficiency tests is what we call the backwash effect, which refers to the influence that a test has on the way students are taught. Here's the thing, there are 2 types of backwash effects, positive and negative. A positive backwash effect happens when a test encourages good teaching. So if the test covers all 4 skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, then teachers will prepare students for all of them, therefore creating a balanced teaching. A negative backwash effect, on the other hand, happens when teachers only focus on what is tested. So if a test is mostly grammar and vocabulary, then teachers might ignore, skills such as speaking or writing. As a result, students may become good at grammar, but they struggle with real-life communication. In the end, proficiency tests are powerful tools, but their design can shape how language is taught, for better or for worse. The second type of language tests is the achievement tests. Unlike proficiency tests, the achievement tests are more connected to language courses. That's why teachers are more involved in them. These tests measure how well students, groups, or even the course itself have met specific objectives. And there are two types of achievement tests: final achievement tests and progress achievement tests. Final achievement tests are given at the end of a course, like a semester 1 or semester 2 exam or an exit exam. Some believe that these tests should be based directly on the syllabus, which means the books and the materials used in class. And this makes sense because it ensures that students are only tested on what they've learned. But there's a problem. If the syllabus is poorly designed, then the test won't accurately measure language ability. For example, a course focused on conversation might only test memorized phrases instead of asking students to do a conversation, which misses the bigger picture. An alternative is to base these tests on the course objectives. This way, the test actually checks if students have met the learning goals. Some may still argue that this could be unfair, especially if the course content doesn't fully match the objectives, but in the long run, this approach leads to more meaningful test results and it pushes course designers to improve materials rather than having teachers teach just to fit the syllabus. Now, progress achievement tests track how well students are working towards those final objectives. So these tests monitor short-term goals and guide learning. Ideally, they should reflect the course objectives and help students prepare for the final achievement test. So one way to do this, like at our school, is by having 1 or 2 progress tests that resemble semester exams. This can be helpful, but it can also be discouraging at the same time if students and teachers feel like they're not really making enough progress because of the scores and the performance teachers see in their students' final work after checking their progress. A better alternative is to set short-term objectives that gradually build up for the final test. If the syllabus and teaching methods align with these objectives, then progress tests will make sense and students and teachers will get useful feedback. Teachers can adjust their strategies and students can improve based on what they learn from the tests. And of course, we have informal pop quizzes here and there. They are good ways to check progress too. And these quick checks help keep students on track and highlight areas that need attention. But at the end of the day, achievement tests based on course objectives give a more accurate picture of students' progress, and they help improve the course itself overall. The third type of test is called diagnostic tests. A diagnostic test helps identify a learner's strengths and weaknesses. It's not about measuring overall proficiency, but it's about pinpointing what still needs improvement. So broad skills like speaking or reading are easier to assess, and even, proficiency tests can sometimes highlight these differences. But when it comes to specific grammar points, things can get a little trickier. For example, if we want to check whether a student truly understands the differences between the present perfect and the past simple tense, then we would need to test them in multiple sections. A single correct answer wouldn't be enough because they might have guessed the answer. That's why fully detailed diagnostic tests are rare, and the ones that do exist often don't provide deep or reliable insights into their strengths and weaknesses. Still, if done right, these tests could be incredibly useful for personalized training or learning. They could show learners exactly where they struggle and guide them toward improvement. But today we have technology, and technology is making things a little bit more possible and easier. For example, computer-based tests can store, large amounts of data, and they adjust to individual needs, and they give instant feedback. So students don't have to wait, to come to class and get feedback from teachers or peers anymore. They can just find out their strengths and weaknesses by just doing diagnostic tests online if they want to see whether they are good or bad at a particular language point or area of the language. Another type, which is the last type of language test, is the placement tests. So placement tests, as the name suggests, help determine the right class or level for a student within a learning program. They ensure that students start at a stage that matches their real abilities. Now, while there are commercially available placement tests, schools or institutions should be cautious before using them. Why? Because no single test fits every teaching program. A test that works well for one school might not suit another. The only real exception is language schools, where many follow similar textbooks and teaching methods. So in these cases, a standardized placement test might be effective. However, the most accurate placement tests are the ones designed specifically for that particular school or institution. These custom-made tests focus on the key learning points at different levels within that school's curriculum. They take time and they may take a lot of effort to create, but the payoff is always worth it because a well-designed in-house test saves time, it saves energy, confusion, because it ensures that students are placed where they will learn most effectively in that specific school. Now that we have looked at the 4 types of language tests, let us look at some more types of language testing. The first type of language testing is called direct and indirect testing, which is something that you did a good job on. Wonderful job. So I'm just here to just give you a recap of what they are. When designing tests, we can take 2 approaches, direct and indirect testing. Now, direct testing is when students perform the exact skill we want to measure. If we need to assess writing, we ask them to write. If you want to test their pronunciation, you have them speak. The tasks should be as realistic as possible, though they may not be fully authentic since students know that they are being tested. But direct testing works best for speaking and writing because these skills naturally produce evidence for or of ability. However, for listening and reading, students must also demonstrate comprehension, so testers must carefully design ways to elicit clear evidence without interfering with their performance. And direct testing has several advantages. First, if we want to know what ability we want to assess, it's fairly simple to create tasks that reveal relevant skills. Again, writing, use or ask students to write. Second, evaluating students' performance, especially in productive skills, is usually quite straightforward. Lastly, direct tests encourage useful practices, which creates a positive backwash effect. Now, indirect testing, on the other hand, measures underlying skills rather than the skill itself. For example, older versions of TOEFL tested, writing ability through grammar exercises. So the older versions of TOEFL tests tested writing ability through grammar exercises that required students to find errors in sentences instead of asking them to write. Another example is testing pronunciations. where students are required to match rhyming words instead of actually speaking or producing the sounds of words. Now, this may work in some cases, but the major issue is that indirect tests often fail to strongly predict real-world performance. Even if we test grammar, vocabulary, handwriting, or pronunciation separately, we still can't accurately predict how well someone will write a full composition or a full text. But given our current knowledge, direct testing is generally the better approach for proficiency and final achievement tests. If we ensure variety, for example, requiring students to write two different types of compositions, we can get a more accurate picture of their abilities than indirect testing would provide. Additionally, direct tests are easier to design and have a more positive impact on teaching. That said, some testers prefer a combination of both. Indirect tests can be useful for diagnosing specific weaknesses like grammar control, but there are also semi-direct tests that attempt to simulate direct testing while maintaining some level of structure. In summary, while both approaches have their place, direct testing is generally more reliable, easier to implement, and offers a clearer reflection of students' abilities. Another type of language testing is discrete point and integrative testing, which is also something that you did a good job on as well. Congratulations. So discrete point testing assesses one language element at a time, item by item. For example, a test might include separate questions for different grammatical structures. In contrast, integrative testing requires candidates to use multiple language skills together to complete a task. Examples include writing a composition, taking notes while listening to a lecture, or doing a dictation, or completing a closed passage. Now, the distinction is closely related to indirect and direct testing. Discrete point tests are typically indirect, while integrative tests tend to be direct. However, some integrative methods like the cloze test are still considered indirect, you know, because they somehow still ask students to just complete the paragraph, which has very little to do with actually using all or two or multiple skills together. And additionally, diagnostic grammar tests, for example, used to identify specific weaknesses are usually discrete point as well, because they only give or ask students to work on separate or item by item. In short, discrete point testing focuses on individual language components, while integrative testing assesses a broader, more connected use of language skills, which means they have to use at least two or three skills together to complete one single task. One more type of language testing is called norm-referenced and criterion-referenced testing. When a student takes a test, their performance can be measured into two ways. Norm reference tests compare a student's score to others. For example, we might say that they scored in the top 10% or better than 60% of the other test takers. Now, these tests rank students but don't directly show what they can do in the actual language. They just show that, okay, these students are at the top of their class, but they don't necessarily tell us how good they actually are when it comes to actually using the language. That's what we call norm-referenced testing, testing to rank students from top to bottom. Criterion-referenced testing, on the other hand, measures what a student can actually do. So instead of comparing scores, these tests check if student needs or meets specific skills or standards. For example, a language certificate might confirm that a student can, greet other people, ask for information, or follow instructions. So it doesn't matter how many students pass or fail. What matters is whether they meet the set criteria. So criterion reference tests help students focus on mastering skills rather than competing with other people or other students. They provide, clear standards that don't change across different test groups, but norm reference tests often require external score interpretation like TOEFL scores, which universities analyze to predict a student's academic readiness. So if you can manage to get at least 500 points in a TOEFL test, then you will be admitted into that university. So they need scores to interpret a person's language ability. Although norm reference tests are more common today, criterion reference tests often have a more positive impact on learning because they encourage students to work toward meaningful goals. One more type of language testing is the objective testing and subjective testing. So the difference between objective and subjective testing is all about scoring methods. Objective tests don't require judgment from the scorer. Multiple choice questions are a clear example. Answers in multiple choice questions are either right or wrong, A or B, making the scoring straightforward and consistent. If the students get A, it is correct. If the students get a B for that multiple choice question, it's wrong. Subjective tests, on the other hand, require judgment. For example, grading a composition, a writing, or a student's comprehension answers is more subjective than scoring short answer questions on a reading passage. So when you are asked to write an essay or asked to write a comprehension question answer, they may be subjective because sometimes a lecturer's feeling might come into play when he or she corrects your answers. That is why I personally don't look at names when I correct your papers, to just limit the biases I may have when it comes to certain students or my feelings. Many testers prefer objective scoring because it's more reliable, consistent, one-way answer. Two different scorers are more likely to agree on the same score. However, even subjective scoring, like grading essays, can be made more reliable if we have clear guidance and clear criteria. For example, when I correct your comprehension answers or your writing, I always have my criteria. For example, what should I judge you on when it comes to that writing? Okay, so I look at your grammar, your overall grammar. I should be a little bit more specific with that too. But I look at your grammar, I look at your content, right? If your content is something that we have been learning, if your grammar is good enough, you get a very high score on that specific answer. Last but not least, we have communicative language testing. And communicative language testing focuses on assessing a person's ability to use language in real-life communication. And that includes speaking, listening, reading, and even writing. The goal is to measure how well someone can understand and respond in meaningful interactions, not just their knowledge of grammar and vocabulary. So experts debate the best way to test communicative skills, but most agree that language should be tested in context that reflects real-world use. Since effective communication is the main objective of learning a language today in this current era, testing should align with this goal. Instead of treating communicative testing as a separate category, its principles should be embedded in all language assessments. So it's not about testing their knowledge, their theory of the language, but let's see how well they can implement what they know in real life context. If they can do that, that means they are what we call competent users. And that's why communicative language testing is what we thrive for in this current era of testing.